Welcome back to the Vanderbilt Political Review Podcast. This is a weird episode because it wasn't intended to be so long, but it ended up being very, very long. I'm not sure if it's going to be 2 or 3 parts, but it certainly is going to be cut up. So this is the first part. And this first half of the discussion focuses with Matthew Yee. He's our social media director, and he's also a Canadian. And yesterday, at the time of the release of this episode, I believe, should have been the Canadian federal election. So he shared his thoughts on that, and we kind of talked about the Canadian system as a whole. So that's what this first part of the podcast, or this first installment of this longer conversation is going to be about. So without further ado, here it is. Matthew, it's good to have you on. It's the first time, no, second time. We have had 2 exec members on. I had Andrew the last time I had 2 exec members on. How could I forget? He's our editor-in-chief, right? Of course. But you're a Canadian.
Yeah.
And your country's having an election in
2 weeks,
2 weeks?
Yeah.
Well, when this comes out, I believe this will come out the day after the election. So, everybody can make fun of us for being wrong.
If we are.
Here's what I know.
Yeah.
Trudeau was not popular. No one liked him.
Yeah.
And Poilievre, the conservative candidate, was doing very good.
Yeah.
And then Trump happened. And then Trudeau stopped happening, right? Carney happened. And now the fortunes, at least according to the polls, show that looks like Poilievre's fortunes have reversed.
Yeah.
Anything I'm missing?
No, I think that's a pretty accurate description of it. I think another aspect of it is the implosion of like the smaller, further to the left party, which is the New Democratic Party.
Right, NDP, yeah.
Yep, which normally flanks to the left of the Liberals. And at the same time that Carney's going up, obviously a portion of that is Conservatives who previously supported Pierre Poilievre, going back to supporting the Liberals. But I think a greater portion of it is definitely the New Democratic supporters who voted New Democrat in the previous elections, or disgruntled Liberals that didn't like Trudeau, moving over to back from the NDP to supporting the Liberals and Mark Carney again, which is why they're also way lower than they were.
But why, I guess, is like why are these shifts happening? Is it just that the hatred for Trudeau was so great and the hatred for Trump is so great?
I think Trump's definitely a portion of it, and I think another portion of it is just fear of what Pierre Poilievre might do if he's in office for those on the left of the spectrum. And as a result, they're looking like which one is the more strategic choice that will prevent him from being able to do so. And certainly now for the general public, it seems like that is the Liberals. And that's why everybody's sort of like herding into the Liberal Party to the detriment of these smaller parties. Like even the Bloc Québécois, which is like the Quebec Sovereigntist Party, is seeing a slight decline in their support because, funnily enough, a lot of Quebecers are looking to Mark Carney, an Anglophone from Edmonton.
Even though his French is atrocious, and I don't even speak French.
Yeah, his French is
it's like barely clearing the bar for like being good enough French for him to be in Canadian federal politics.
Yeah.
For context, to be in Canadian federal politics, you have to be bilingual.
Yeah.
Just for context.
And like if you were applying for a federal government job, for instance.
Even just a job?
Yeah, like.
Really?
Like they will heavily prioritize those who are bilingual.
Okay. So it's not a requirement, but it's
not a requirement.
I was going to say that's kind of crazy. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But, I guess my question from that would then be, I guess a couple of things. Well, first, I'll start with this. Why or what exactly are they afraid Poilievre's going to do?
I think the source of fear is from several. One is like the gutting of government services, because I think
DOGE, but Canada version.
DOGE, but Canada version, sort of. And I think this is two-pronged. One is sort of like Pierre Poilievre has like traditionally been a more on like in the Conservative Party, there's like two sort of wings, like red Tories and blue Tories. And Pierre Poilievre has traditionally been part of like the blue Tory stream of the Conservative Party.
Another contextualization for the viewership.
Yep.
Blue is conservative, the color for conservatism in like the rest of the Anglophone world.
Yep.
Red is the color of liberal/labor governments in the rest of the Anglophone world. So
Yeah.
blue means more conservative
Yeah.
in this case. Yeah.
And this actually stems back to like the 1990s when there were two right of center parties in Canada, the Progressive Conservatives, who were
Kim Campbell,
who were like red Tories,
Yeah.
and the Reform Party of Canada, later called the Alliance, which were more blue Tories. And Pierre Poilievre has always been the sort of the blue Tory, more small government type of conservative. And so I think one fear is like he will return to a more both fiscally and socially conservative mainstream form of government that hails from like more the west of Canada, which is sort of frowned upon in the eastern portions of Canada as like being too conservative to be acceptable. The second fear in that regard is Justin Trudeau, especially in like his third mandate since 2021, has introduced like some new social spending programs with the support of the NDP, like dental care and the framework of
free dental care
for
everyone.
And the framework of pharmacare, which is for drugs, like pharmaceutical drugs.
Right.
And currently it's just diabetes medications and contraceptives.
Wait.
Like,
Wait, pause. So the Canadian government pays for people's diabetic drugs.
yeah, in the current form of pharmacare.
They pay for I'm not familiar how this works. So
Right.
pharmacare pays. What is pharmacare instead of me trying to guess?
Right. So currently I think it's more of a framework, so it's not like fully implemented yet.
But somewhat implemented.
But yes, there's like a rough framework legislation on the table. And the idea is the government will like subsidize your like diabetes medication and contraceptives.
The second, why is the government trying to? Why is a country that's smaller than the size of California trying to subsidize people's contraceptives?
I think it's like for people to have the choice of. I think that's the idea, for people to have the choice.
Obviously like we didn't come here to talk about that.
Yeah.
But it's one thing to say. We're getting maybe it's a good segue to like the whole political philosophy thing that you wanted to talk about. It's one thing to say that, you know, as a government, we're going to be agnostic on the question of we'll let you. I'll put it in simpler terms. We'll let people have the freedom to, you know, pursue their you know sexual proclivities as they wish.
Yeah.
It's nothing to actively support it. I don't know. It's very weird to me that the government's going to help people pay for their contraception.
Yeah. And I think like, I'll just like finish the point.
Sorry.
I was on. And then
it really threw me off. Okay.
Yeah, we can like get to that real quick. But like there was like government subsidized dental care and government subsidized like framework pharmacare. I think the plan is for it to expand to like more pharmaceuticals in the future. But those were like two that were introduced by the Trudeau government in their third mandate since 2021. And because they're relatively like new welfare programs, I think there's the fear that if Pierre Poilievre was to come into office, a lot of that would be rescinded because it's still a relatively new program. And I think the third aspect of it is Pierre Poilievre is sort of like bulldog style politician. I think that's like
Apple clip and the
the Apple clip and the question period, which makes him famous. And I think, especially for the older Canadian generation, they see like echoes of like Trump in
I've heard that before,
And obviously that's like a repulsive force, especially to the older, more traditional minded voter.
Yeah. Well, I guess let's finish up the whole Canadian conversation and we can turn. But do you think Poilievre is going to win? Because the polling says heck no.
And certainly at like this stage, in like based on what we know now, right?
We're 2 weeks away.
Yeah, we're 2 weeks
away. How
away.
much more can change, you know?
And somewhat, I think, like, depending on, here's what I'll say. Like, I think we've seen in history, and this is like a lot of part of the discourse, we've seen in history at least twice, 1984 with John Turner and Brian Mulroney. So John Turner was the liberal, Brian Mulroney was the conservative. And again in 1993 with Jean Chrétien, the liberal, and Kim Campbell, the conservative, where...
For context, Kim Campbell was the only female Canadian prime minister. And 4 months, 3 months? How many months was she prime minister for?
3 months.
3
I think
months?
from June to September of 1993. And then
disaster zone.
Yeah, she went from 158 seats to 2 seats in parliament. So
2 seats. It was that bad. I knew it was bad. I knew it was that bad.
Yeah, worst defeat of a incumbent governing party in Western liberal democracies.
2 seats?
Yep.
For the Conservatives?
Yeah.
Is that where the party basically restructured itself and like went from being was that when the Progressive Conservatives were formed, or was that when it dissolved?
It was when Reform took over as the largest conservative party.
Basically what
Nigel Farage is trying to do in the UK.
Called again? Reform UK. Yeah. Duh. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Basically what that's trying to do.
You know.
But yes, and both John Turner's defeat in 1984, and Kim Campbell's defeat in 1993 was the subbing out of a candidate for a very unpopular prime minister. Right. In John Turner's case, it was Pierre Trudeau.
Right.
And in Kim Campbell's case, it was Brian Mulroney. And both saw surges after they were the parties replaced their leader. And in the end, they were both defeated. So there's like historical precedent of like a new prime minister having a honeymoon period, but then losing the campaign. The extent to which that precedent applies to this campaign, I'm not too sure, because both of those campaign periods were longer than this one. They were like, for example, in 1993, it was a 3-month premiership before they went to the polls. This time it's like just over a month from when Mark Carney became prime minister. So...
And I do think that Trudeau is trying to drag that out a little bit, I think. Yeah.
But, and certainly, so the honeymoon period is still there, most certainly. So if there's going to be a shift in this campaign, which there can be, I remember in the 2021 election, there was like swing of like 5 points, give or take, throughout the same period, 30-day campaign. So if there's going to be a change in this campaign, I think it's going to probably will happen during the leadership debates, which are going to happen like about a week before the voting officially starts.
So that's the equivalent of like our presidential debates.
Yeah. So
it hasn't happened yet?
No, that hasn't happened yet. So there's going to be 2. There's going to be one in French.
There's going to be 2
debates.
2 weeks. That's tight.
Yeah.
That's tight, Canada.
Yeah. It's actually in like a few days. Today's what?
Really?
Yeah. Like I think in 4 or 5 days they're going to happen. And one's going to be in French, and one's going to be in English. So,
well, I wonder how Mike Carney's going to do with his terrible French.
Yeah, that's like definitely what we're all watching for, right? Yeah. Does he make some mistake in the French debate, or does something else happen in the French debate? Because in 2021, what happened was there was a reporter who asked a question I think it might have been one of the debates, the French or the English debates, and it was to the Bloc Québécois leader. And it was a question that was, I think, seen as like sort of condescending in Quebec, sort of not understanding of what Quebec like thought on like the issue was. And so that sort of helped the Bloc Québécois in a way, because the Bloc Québécois leaders, like, he smacked it down. So leadership debates, like, they can definitely change the dynamic of the campaign. And so
interesting. Yeah, well, I guess one more thing on this is just how the stress to our south of the border viewers, including myself, but I know this, so I'll share it, that in Canada, so what Canadians voting for is not directly, I almost said Mulroney, wow, may he rest in peace. Now, Carney or Poilievre, they're voting for the equivalent, so they're called ridings, right?
Yeah, the equivalent of
like their congressman.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think a good way to think of this is if the House of Representatives was the entire government,
Right.
and whoever was the Speaker of the House would become Prime Minister. And so
it would be Mike Johnson versus Hakeem Jeffries, basically.
Yeah. So you would be voting for your individual like congressperson. That I guess that would be the equivalent, and then their party leader would become the leader of the country.
Right. Which I think is insane, but maybe that's a good segue, right?
Yeah.
I guess. So I think the parliamentary system's insane. Let me rephrase. I think that the way Canada does its parliamentary system is kind of insane in that
Yeah.
it's insane. It's insane given all the talk of democracy in the modern West and how important, like it is not to have like one person having a lot of power and because everyone's like, oh, America has all these undemocratic things, but I guess I'll just get to the point instead of talking around it. So in Canada, the Prime Minister, and if I'm wrong, correct me, the Prime Minister can appoint senators.
The Prime Minister can appoint senators.
The Prime Minister can prorogue the Parliament, like, suspend it, what Trudeau did once he stepped down and announced he was stepping down in December.
Yeah.
Basically shut down Parliament for
about a month. Yeah.
About a month?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought it was like for as ever long as he. Because I thought he could get away with pushing it even longer. But
it was supposed to be until March the 24th from January something. So just over a month.
Think of Donald Trump shutting down Congress.
Yeah.
Think of Donald Trump appointing the Senate.
Yeah.
Right. Think of, and also the way the parliamentary system works inherently is that if you are the Prime Minister, you have the majority to pass whatever you want. I mean, obviously, like you can. Obviously, people in your caucus can break down.
Yeah.
But, and there are more examples of this, right? But a lot of it stems from this reality, right? That if you are the Prime Minister, that presumes that either your party has an outright majority in Parliament, which means you have all the control. It's not like the bicameral thing we have here in terms of control like that, right? And if anything, he controls the Senate because he appoints people, right?
Yeah.
Or you have a coalition, but it's the same principle. The point is, like, imagine if Donald Trump, by virtue of him being president, had a Republican majority,
which he
filibuster-proof, effective. Because do you guys have filibusters?
We do have filibusters.
You do? Yeah. Okay. Is it like a thing like here, or is it?
It's slightly different.
Okay.
But
can you like pull a? I was gonna say a Hakeem Jeffries, but he didn't actually do a filibuster. But the principle of what he was trying to do, could you like just talk forever and like shut the whole thing down?
I think the filibuster in Canada is slightly different.
Okay.
Cloture, I think, is closer to 50% than 60 votes.
Mm-hmm.
But there have been known to be instances of filibusters in the Parliament. And I guess if I could like say something on the points you made.
I was talking for a while.
Yeah,
sorry.
no, I think it's true, like in parliamentary democracies, right? Not just in like Canada, but I guess in the UK as well, in like Australia, like the Prime Minister, through having the confidence of Parliament, has a lot of power. I personally, I look more favorably upon the parliamentary system, and I think go through.
Of course, you're Canadian. You're good. Okay.
a few points you brought up. I think the first is like the role of the Senate and how like the Prime Minister appoints the Senate. Like in Canada, the Senate, for instance, you serve for life until you're 75, at which point you're mandatorily retired. What this has historically done is give a sort of counterbalance in the sense that oftentimes when one party's voted out of office, their appointed senators remain in the Senate.
I see.
And so what that has historically done is left like a sort of divided parliament. For instance, Brian Mulroney, when his Conservative government went into power, right, after 10 years of Liberal rule, he had to contend with a Liberal-controlled Senate. And so that created some problems for him, especially when he was trying to do the general sales tax in the 1980s, and the Liberal Senate was fiercely opposed to that. And then he had to use like a constitutional maneuver to appoint more senators than the Senate was supposed to have.
He court-packed the Senate, basically.
Yeah, he court-packed the Senate. But I think in the parliamentary tradition, right, in the UK and in Canada, less so in Australia, surprisingly, but in like the traditional Westminster idea, the Senate normally doesn't reject outright the House of the will because they're aware of their nature as like an appointed body versus the House as an elected body. And by convention, the Senate is sort of like the chamber of what we call sober second thought, where like we sort of look at the legislation. Normally what happens is it gets fine-tuned, like some amendments are made, but historically it's been rare for the Senate to outright reject legislation. What's happened more in recent years is Trudeau undertook Senate reform starting in like 2014, but after he took power, in 2015, he did more reform, and now the Senate is less partisan. The only party that actually officially has members in the Senate is the Conservative Party.
Really?
Yes.
Wait, how'd that happen?
So Trudeau ejected all of the Liberal senators from the Liberal Party in 2014. So now the majority of the Senate...
2014?
Yeah, when he became Liberal Party leader.
Oh, okay. He wasn't Prime Minister. Okay.
He ejected all of his...
Wait, how did he do that if he wasn't Prime Minister? Because Harper was still Prime Minister.
He was the Liberal Party leader. So he expelled all the Liberal senators from the party.
From the party?
From the party. So they were still senators. They just sat as independents.
Why did he do that?
Because he wanted to do this sort of make the Senate nonpartisan. So he started with ejecting.
Oh, but everyone can see right through that, though. They're all liberal. Just because they lack the label, on Tuesday when they had it on Monday does not mean that they're all of a sudden.
Yes, and I think what he's tried to do since then, like at least on appearance, is appoint so-called like independent senators, in the sense that they're not like affiliated with political parties. I think that has worked to some extent. I think he still appoints partisans. Like there are still like members of the Liberal Party or like closely affiliated with the Liberal parties that still gets appointed to the Senate. But I think what he's tried to do, to varying degrees of success that can be debated, is appoint people who are like more independent minded, more like technocratic.
Well, okay. Well, that I guess I just follow. But I guess what I would say, and to kind of push the political philosophy discussion, is to move it out of Canada more into the abstract. I think what would be even more based, as we would say, is to have the king appoint your senators.
So the king technically does appoint the senators. Yeah,
but I mean, like, I mean, seriously, like the House of Lords, because I believe the right? The king, the monarch, let's keep it neutral, is the one. Because I remember, like, at least in the TV show The Crown, at least, the queen was the one who made Margaret Thatcher a baroness. Yeah. Right? I'm just saying, I think that would be, but I guess it kind of gets more to the political philosophy discussion. Yeah. I do think, in a British model, for example, just to kind of make it more concrete, the House of Lords in Britain, they have that same kind of role that the Senate in Canada does, which probably is why the Senate in Canada has that role. They're more just like, I think the way you put it was perfect. You said the sober second eyes.
Sober second thought.
Sober second thought, right.
But if I could speak to the House of Lords for a second, the House of Lords is actually weaker than the Canadian Senate, in the sense that in the UK, if the House of Lords rejects a bill proposed by the House of Commons, the House of Commons can override the House of Lords. With like a 2/3 thing, or just like just outright override? I'm not sure of the specific mechanic, but they can do it.
In Canada, that's not the case?
So, yeah, it's not the case.
So if the Canadian Senate kills a bill, that's it? It's just dead?
Well, it can be brought up again.
Oh, brought up again. Okay, I see.
Yeah, like the House of Lords in the UK is definitely weaker than the Senate in Canada.
Well, see, I don't think it should be. I think, and of course, I'm willing to be talked out of this for prudential reasons, but I just kind of ad-libbing it right now. I could see it being quite interesting, at least, to have a House of Lords that is like, I mean, by definition, like literally the aristocratic, wing of government in Britain. And I think there's, as a good conservative, a true conservative, I think there's something there, to have like the rabble rousel in the House of Commons, you've seen prime minister's questions either in your country and especially Britain, especially like when the speaker wore the wig and everything. Yeah. And you have some characters there, And I think there's the sober. What was it again?
Sober second thought.
I think sober second thought should be expanded. I think that there's some merit to at least exploring that idea, or even if things get bad enough.
Yeah.
Like for example, I think it'd be a dereliction of duty for the king. To sit. Let's say something like let's say the parliament just like Britain kind of starts getting a little. Things start kind of the parliament's not really passing things. London's kind of halfway there now from what I've seen. Never been there, but from what I've seen, let's say London really gets out of control. Let's say the country really starts slipping. I can see the king walking in there and saying, all right, we've had a good run for now, but we need to reestablish. Or I'm just riffing here, but
I think there actually is also some like historical precedent for that. I think I'll say like two things on that point. I think since Trudeau's Senate reforms, you kind of see a rise of that sort of like sober second thought in the Canadian Senate, in the sense that they've started like making more amendments to bills proposed by the House. They've also started like rejecting like bills outright since being proposed by the House. And I think this is sort of like, in my view, I know a lot there's like a strain of thought on the Canadian left that like the Senate should be abolished. I think like there's
mob rule pretty much, basically.
I think there's a purpose for the Senate as an institution of like technocrats where
I was gonna go there, but okay.
Or like where like you sort of like examine the legislation that's being proposed more carefully and you think about like the implications.
I see. Yeah, okay. I can see that. Yeah.
I think in regards to like the role of the monarch in restraining like Parliament, I think there's like two principles in a parliamentary system. One is obviously the supremacy of the parliamentary system, like of the legislative over the executive and the judicial. I think that's a principle of like parliamentary systems in both Canada and the UK. But there's also the idea that all power ultimately stems from the king.
Yes.
Like the king on the bench is the judiciary. The king in council is the executive. The king on the bench, the king in parliament is the legislative. And I think one example I like to use is the constitutional crisis in Australia in 1968, where it was a Labour prime minister at the time. And for context, Labour is the left-wing party in Australia, and the Liberal Party is the right-wing party in Australia.
Which I think, anyway,
for context, but yeah.
I'll circle back to that.
Yeah, but so there was a Labour prime minister. He wanted to get some spending bills passed. He couldn't get it through the Australian Senate because there was like Liberal resistance, and the Labour didn't have that many seats in the Australian Senate. So the Labour Prime Minister goes to the Governor General, who's the representative of the King in Australia, and asks for like to dissolve the Senate and to have a like half Senate election, which is something that happens in Australia.
A half Senate election?
Yeah, like you know how like the US Senate is elected in
in 3 classes. Okay, I see. Okay.
In Australia they have 2 classes.
Right.
But yeah.
Okay.
So
that makes sense.
He asked for that election, and the Governor General is like, no. He dismisses the Labour Prime Minister. He invites the Liberal Prime Minister, the Liberal leader, to form a government. The Liberal leader becomes Prime Minister. He passes the spending bills, and then he calls an election, and he wins the subsequent election. So
it's funny.
That's like the 1968 or somewhere around that range. Australian constitutional crisis. It was like a huge dispute between like the Prime Minister and the Governor General, and it's sort of like one of the last instances in history where like the royal prerogative is sort of used to like restrict the power of the Prime Minister and of Parliament in a very strong way.
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest problem would just be that like we're so accustomed, for better or for worse, just like a total descriptive thing I'm saying now. We're so accustomed in the West to this idea of democracy in the modern Western liberal sense, right? That the very notion of the as you said the royal prerogatives of the term, right, being evoked is almost blasphemous, if you will, right? What it would do to the monarchy, it certainly would revive serious calls for it to be abolished. In fact, that might be the death knell for it. assuming that the monarch doesn't relinquish power.
Yeah.
And then but
Yeah, no, I think, and like in parliamentary democracies, especially in the Westminster system, right, the monarch actually retains like significant reserve powers, which are like rarely used. Like in Canada, for instance, there's this power called disallowance, which is the federal government can ask the monarch to disallow a piece of provincial legislation. Like if a provincial legislature were to pass a law, the federal government could disallow the law and like basically step in and say this law is moot. And
is that how they could have gotten around Quebec in 1995? If Quebec was like, we're going to secede.
I don't think that was the method.
Oh, okay. I'm just curious. That would be interesting if
this allowance this allowance has historically been used on like when the provinces tried to legislate in federal jurisdiction.
Oh, I see.
Like the early 1900s, Saskatchewan, which is sort of like a very like big government province at the time, their government during the Great Depression tried to legislate on banking issues. And that was like a very like federal jurisdiction thing. And so a lot of those bills were disallowed. But I don't think this allowance has been used since like the 1940s.
Interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah.
But don't you guys have I guess this whole podcast is about Canada at this point.
Yeah.
But don't you guys have like a judiciary to handle? Like, for example, if the state of Florida, where I'm from, tried to, I'll give you a real world case. Arizona, right?
Yeah.
A couple years ago, it was US v. Arizona. I can't remember the specifics, but basically Arizona, either at the county level or the state police level, in Arizona, like the Arizona level, state level, they're trying to, in some way, again, I can't remember the specifics, they're trying to legislate or rule or enforce immigration policy. Yeah. Like without like now the states are enforcing the federal immigration policy because the federal, I guess the government's inviting them to do so, but on their own, right? If I'm remembering the facts right. And it became a Supreme Court case and the court settled that, right?
Yeah.
I guess is a Canadian judiciary just impotent to just say, hey, no, Saskatchewan, you can't. I mean, maybe you're not sure of this, but I'm just curious.
So I think there's two things on that. One is, so to premise, there's the Canadian equivalent of the U.S. Bill of Rights, which is called the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it's the Charter of Rights, basically. Right. Canadian courts do have the ability to strike down legislation that's unconstitutional, that violates like the rights in the Charter. There is this section of, very controversial section of the Charter called Section 33, or more colloquially, the notwithstanding clause, which is when any, and this again goes back to the principle of like parliamentary supremacy, which is that the legislative branch should have control over the judiciary to an extent. The notwithstanding clause says, if explicitly evoked, the legislatures can declare that a law operates notwithstanding the protected rights, some protected rights, not all, in the Charter, and therefore, even if it's technically unconstitutional, it will still operate because it's operating notwithstanding the constitutional rights protections in the Charter. Now, this doesn't apply to everything. Like, you can't like suspend elections. Like, there's like
infinitely no more elections.
Yeah, you can't do that.
It's carny time. Yeah.
Yeah. There's like restrictions on, like, for example, like you can't prorogue Parliament forever. Like Parliament has to sit like minimally once every year.
Okay, so I was wrong about that, but okay.
So that's like
that's
good. Constitutional. You have to have elections every 5 years,
yes,
like maximum. That's in the Constitution. But there are rights you can suspend, such as like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of protest. Those are rights you can suspend.
And to be honest, we basically through precedent have a version of that in America, because I mean, you pour through precedent and you can find laundry list of exceptions to every amendment. I'm sure, so. There's a more informal version of that. Yeah. Like, I imagine, let's say, this happened in World War I, arguably, with the Schenck, I think, never pronounced it that
Schneider.
Case. No, it was like Schenck.
Schenck versus the United States.
Yeah. You can see a situation, especially in a wartime, in which the government would, I think most people would agree, just in general, like, probably would have the right to say, hey, and you can't do a mass campaign to turn Americans against the government at this time using your free speech.